The sleepy suburb of Westwood Pines was known for its manicured lawns, tree-lined streets, and quiet cul-de-sacs. On the surface, it was an idyllic community where families thrived, children played outside until dusk, and neighbors waved to each other in passing. But, hidden behind the facade of normalcy, a dark and twisted secret was festering, one that would eventually spiral into a horrifying tragedy that shook the entire town. In the center of this secret were two couples, Daniel and Claire Mason and Stephen and Rachel Carter. Both in their mid-30s, they appeared to be the perfect pairs. Daniel worked as a financial consultant, Claire was a successful real estate agent. Stephen owned a local gym, and Rachel taught at the local elementary school. They met through mutual friends at a neighborhood barbecue, quickly becoming close. From shared dinners to weekend getaways, the bond between the two couples deepened, but their friendship harbored a dangerous undercurrent. Behind closed doors, these gatherings took a darker turn. What began as innocent evenings filled with food and wine soon evolved into something far more sinister. After a few too many glasses of wine, the couples engaged in partner swapping, a secret sexual arrangement that they thought was just harmless fun. At first, they rationalized it as a way to spice up their marriages, believing that it would bring them closer. But this arrangement quickly spiraled out of control, leading to unhealthy attachments, jealousy, and an emotional entanglement that neither couple could have predicted. What started as casual evenings of indulgence turned into dangerous obsessions that would end in bloodshed. On the morning of November 12, 2018, at approximately 6:15 a.m., a frantic 911 call was received by the local police department. The voice on the other end was panicked, a man screaming incoherently between gasps for breath. He identified himself as Daniel Mason and said that two people were dead inside his home. My wife, Claire, she's dead," he choked out. "And Rachel Carter, oh God, she's here too. They're both dead. They're both dead." The dispatcher, attempting to calm him, asked for clarification. Daniel's voice cracked with terror as he explained that the bodies were in his living room. "Their throats, there's so much blood. I don't know what happened." Daniel continued, his voice bordering on hysteria. Within minutes, police officers and emergency personnel arrived at the Mason residence, a two-story house at the end of a quiet street. Inside, they were greeted with a scene of horror. In the living room, sprawled on the floor in a pool of blood, were the bodies of Claire Mason and Rachel Carter. Both women had deep lacerations to their necks, and signs of a brutal struggle were evident from the overturned furniture and broken glass littering the room. As detectives cordoned off the scene, Daniel Mason was escorted outside, shaking and pale, his clothes stained with blood. The investigators immediately knew they had a double homicide on their hands, but the true horror of what had happened inside that house was yet to be uncovered. In any tragedy, the key to understanding lies within the people at the heart of the story. In the case of the Westwood Pines murders, the lives of Daniel and Claire Mason and Stephen and Rachel Carter became intricately intertwined, leading to a violent and deadly unraveling. To the outside world, these two couples appeared to have everything: a successful career, a beautiful home, and loving marriages. But behind their suburban veneer, each individual was carrying personal secrets, hidden desires, and unresolved tensions that contributed to the eventual catastrophe. Daniel Mason was, by all accounts, an unassuming man. At 36, he had built a comfortable life for himself as a financial consultant, spending most of his days at the office and his nights relaxing at home with his wife, Claire. Daniel was introverted, preferring quiet nights in with a book or a movie rather than socializing with others. Those who knew him described him as dependable and steady, but also noted that he lacked the passion and spontaneity that Claire craved. Daniel loved Claire, but their marriage had grown cold, especially as Claire became more outgoing and adventurous in recent years. He had never expected their lives to take the dark turn they did, but when the couple entered the world of partner swapping, Daniel's sense of control and stability began to crumble. What no one realized was that Daniel's quiet nature masked deep insecurities. Claire's growing emotional distance fueled his feelings of inadequacy. He became obsessed with the idea that he wasn't enough for her. Even as they began experimenting with other couples to spice up their marriage, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that he was losing Claire, first physically, then emotionally. The arrangement, which was supposed to be a shared experience between them, became a slow unraveling of their bond. As Claire's attraction to Stephen Carter grew stronger, Daniel found himself increasingly isolated within his own marriage. The jealousy he tried so hard to suppress began to fester, and he started monitoring Claire's phone calls and emails, searching for signs of infidelity beyond their agreed-upon activities. By the time he confirmed the affair, Daniel was consumed with feelings of betrayal. His rage, bottled up for months, would soon explode in a moment of deadly violence. Claire Mason, on the other hand, was the polar opposite of her husband. At 34, she was vibrant, sociable, and ambitious. A successful real estate agent, she thrived on personal connections and excitement. Claire had always been the life of the party, the kind of woman who lit up any room she walked into. To those who knew her casually, Claire seemed to have it all: a handsome husband, a beautiful home, and a thriving career. But beneath her polished exterior, Claire felt trapped in the routine of suburban life. Her marriage to Daniel, once full of passion, had become stifling and dull. It was Claire who had first suggested the idea of exploring their sexuality with another couple. She framed it as a way to rekindle the spark in their relationship, but deep down, she was seeking something more, a sense of freedom and excitement that Daniel could no longer provide. When she met Stephen Carter, she found exactly what she had been missing. Stephen was everything Daniel was not: bold, athletic, and magnetic. The chemistry between them was instant, and while the partner-swapping arrangement was initially meant to be casual, Claire quickly developed deep feelings for Stephen. The two began an affair, sneaking away to see each other outside of their arranged evenings. What started as a thrill soon turned into an emotional attachment, and Claire became increasingly reckless, openly expressing her dissatisfaction with Daniel in front of their friends, including Stephen's wife, Rachel. In her mind, Claire believed she could have it all: her marriage, her affair, her secret life. But her desire to hold on to everything without consequence would ultimately set the stage for her own demise. Stephen Carter was 35 years old and the epitome of the alpha male persona. He owned a local gym and was well liked in the community for his outgoing nature and athletic physique. Stephen exuded confidence. He was charming, self-assured, and the kind of man people naturally gravitated toward. His marriage to Rachel had started out strong, but over the years, the two had grown apart. While Rachel was quiet and introverted, preferring the domestic side of life, Stephen had always been hungry for excitement and adventure. When Stephen and Claire met at a neighborhood event, the attraction was immediate. Unlike Daniel, Stephen was forward and unapologetically flirtatious. It wasn't long before the two began having an affair, a relationship that was far more than just physical for Claire. For Stephen, however, it was different. He saw it as nothing more than a casual indulgence, a way to satisfy his own ego and desires without ever intending to leave his wife. Stephen didn't see himself as someone capable of genuine emotional attachment beyond his physical needs. Despite this, Stephen found himself drawn deeper into the complicated dynamic between the two couples. His affair with Claire gave him a sense of power and control, but it also fed his more selfish tendencies. He had no idea that his casual approach to the arrangement would ultimately ignite the deadly fuse of jealousy and obsession. Rachel Carter, 33, was the quietest and most emotionally fragile of the four. She had married Stephen when they were both young, and though their relationship started out filled with promise, the years had been unkind to her. Stephen's focus on his business, combined with his flirtatious behavior, left Rachel feeling neglected and insecure. Over time, she had become increasingly isolated, relying on her role as a schoolteacher and her friendships in the neighborhood for a sense of stability. When the two couples first began their intimate arrangement, Rachel was hesitant but felt pressured to participate to keep Stephen happy. She believed that if she refused, she would lose him entirely. What she hadn't anticipated was the emotional toll it would take on her. As Stephen's affair with Claire deepened, Rachel became aware of it but remained silent, hoping that it would eventually pass. However, her silence only allowed her resentment to grow. Rachel was deeply in love with Stephen, and the thought of losing him terrified her. She felt trapped in a situation where she was constantly being compared to the more confident, alluring Claire. The evening of the murders, all of that built-up fear and resentment finally reached its breaking point. But beneath the surface, the dynamics between them were shifting in dangerous ways. That evening, the Masons hosted the gathering at their spacious home. The house was immaculate, a reflection of Claire's attention to detail and her need to maintain appearances. The kitchen was filled with the smells of roasting meat, fresh bread, and the clinking of wine glasses. The couples greeted each other with familiarity, sharing polite small talk about their weeks, but under the surface, the air was thick with unspoken tension. For Claire, that night was supposed to be a release. Her affair with Stephen had given her an intoxicating sense of power, a break from the monotony of her marriage to Daniel. She had spent hours getting ready, choosing a low-cut dress she knew Stephen would appreciate. She craved his attention, and as she poured glasses of red wine for everyone, her eyes met his across the room in a silent exchange of desire. They had become more brazen in their affair, and Claire had grown careless, convinced that neither Daniel nor Rachel suspected the depth of their betrayal. But she was wrong. Daniel Mason felt the weight of his wife's infidelity pressing down on him like never before. He had known for weeks that Claire's relationship with Stephen had crossed the line from casual to something far more dangerous. He had found the messages on her phone, intimate, explicit texts that made his stomach turn. Claire had assured him, again and again, that everything was under control, that the partner swapping was just an experiment. But Daniel wasn't blind. He saw how Claire looked at Stephen, the way her face lit up in his presence in a way it hadn't for him in years. As he stood by the grill that evening, flipping steaks with methodical precision, his mind raced. He tried to keep his emotions in check, playing the role of the quiet, composed husband, but his jealousy was eating away at him. He could feel his anger building, each glance between Claire and Stephen stoking the fire. In his heart, he knew that something had to change. Daniel had never been a violent man, but that night, the darkness inside him was growing. The alcohol wasn't helping. By the third glass of wine, his thoughts had grown muddled, and the quiet voice of reason that normally kept his emotions in check had all but disappeared. As he looked at Claire, laughing with Stephen over some shared joke, Daniel began to imagine what it would feel like to end it all. In his mind, everything was still under control. The affair with Claire had been a thrilling escape from the routines of his marriage, but he had never intended for it to become something serious. For Stephen, it was all about the excitement, the rush of being desired by someone other than his wife. He never imagined the consequences of his actions could lead to anything more than a few hurt feelings. That night, Stephen was in his usual carefree mood, laughing, drinking, and enjoying the company of the Masons. He didn't notice the tension in the air, or if he did, he chose to ignore it. Stephen had always believed he could charm his way out of any situation. If things got too complicated, he could simply walk away. But what Stephen failed to realize was that this was not a game. The relationships he had toyed with were on the verge of collapse, and his inability to see that would cost him everything. Stephen had no idea that Daniel was growing increasingly volatile, or that Rachel had reached her emotional breaking point. He continued to flirt with Claire openly, touching her arm as they spoke, making suggestive comments when they thought no one was listening. He was playing a dangerous game, one that had no winner. As the night wore on, the atmosphere in the Mason household grew more tense, despite the outward appearance of normal. At one point, Claire and Stephen slipped away from the group, disappearing into a side room under the guise of needing privacy. Daniel noticed immediately but said nothing, his jaw clenched, his knuckles white as he gripped his drink. Rachel, too, saw them leave, and a cold chill ran down her spine. In that moment, everything she had been suppressing came to the surface. The events that would follow in the early hours of the next morning were set into motion that night. The alcohol, the hidden emotions, the jealousy, and the betrayal had all created a perfect storm. The thin veneer of civility that had held them together for so long was about to shatter, and when it did, there would be no turning back. What none of them knew was that by the end of the night, two of them would be dead, and their lives would be forever changed. The darkness lurking in each of their hearts had finally taken hold, and as the clock ticked toward midnight, the tragedy that had been building for months was about to erupt in unimaginable violence. The night before was not just a simple dinner party. It was the calm before the storm, a seemingly normal gathering that masked the dark emotions and dangerous desires lurking beneath the surface. The small betrayals, the lingering glances, and the unspoken resentments would all culminate in a night of horror that no one could have predicted. But for those who survived, the scars of that night would never fade. The night before the murders began like any other for the two couples, a casual dinner at the Masons' home. Claire Mason, ever the meticulous hostess, prepared an elaborate meal while Daniel grilled outside, trying to suppress the growing storm of jealousy that had been consuming him for weeks. Inside the house, the table was set with precision, and bottles of wine were opened as if it were a celebration, masking the darker intentions brewing beneath the surface. Claire was excited for the evening, dressing to catch Stephen's eye. Her affair with him had evolved beyond casual, and the thrill of it consumed her. As the couples exchanged pleasantries, she and Stephen exchanged furtive glances, their connection more palpable than ever. But her husband, Daniel, had noticed it all. Every lingering look between them stoked the fire of his resentment. His grip on the wine glass tightened, his mind racing through the ways he could confront them, but he remained silent, waiting for the right moment. Rachel Carter, on the other hand, drank more than usual. She had long suspected the affair between her husband Stephen and Claire, but denial was easier than facing the truth. This night, though, her tolerance for the deceit was wearing thin. She watched them both closely, her mind clouded with a mix of humiliation and fury. The alcohol dulled her restraint, and she began to contemplate what she could do to end this betrayal. The four of them continued their ritual, eating and drinking together in a dance of false laughter and hidden resentment. When the dinner ended, the couples retired to their separate rooms for the night's illicit exchange of partners. Claire and Stephen slipped away, feeding their obsession, while Daniel and Rachel, now left alone, simmered in their combined jealousy and despair. The boundaries that had once defined their relationships had long since disappeared. Little did they know, this evening's transgressions were pushing each of them to a breaking point. The darkness in their hearts had grown too powerful to contain, and by morning, two of them would be dead, victims of the very passions they had tried so hard to indulge. The early hours of the morning were still, the quiet suburban neighborhood blanketed in an eerie calm. Inside the Mason household, however, the tension that had simmered throughout the evening erupted into a storm of violence and bloodshed. What had begun as another night of secret indulgence between the two couples was about to end in unimaginable horror. Around 2 a.m., Daniel Mason, unable to sleep, rose from bed. His thoughts were consumed with images of his wife Claire in the other room with Stephen, her affair no longer deniable. Daniel had always struggled with jealousy, but the events of that night had brought it to a boiling point. He could no longer suppress his rage. Fueled by alcohol and a profound sense of betrayal, he made his way toward the master bedroom, where his wife and his friend were. Meanwhile, Rachel Carter, who had grown increasingly suspicious of the depth of her husband Stephen's involvement with Claire, lay awake in the guest room. The weight of her suspicions, combined with her own feelings of humiliation, left her on edge. She, too, had consumed more alcohol than usual that night, and her mind was clouded with anger. In her haze, she decided to confront Stephen and Claire, no longer able to bear the deceit that had become so obvious. What followed was chaos. Rachel stormed into the master bedroom, catching Stephen and Claire in a compromising position. Her worst fears were confirmed. The confrontation was immediate and brutal, with accusations flying and voices raised. Rachel screamed at Stephen, but before the argument could escalate further, Daniel appeared in the doorway, his face twisted with rage. The sight of his wife with another man shattered the last thread of his self-control. In a blind fury, Daniel grabbed the heavy metal candlestick from a nearby dresser and struck Stephen across the head with full force. The impact was sickening, the room suddenly filled with the sound of flesh meeting metal, followed by a heavy thud as Stephen crumpled to the floor, unconscious, his skull fractured. Blood pooled quickly on the bedroom floor, soaking into the carpet, but Daniel wasn't done. Claire, still frozen in shock, tried to scream, but her voice caught in her throat. In his rage, Daniel turned on her next. He swung the candlestick again, hitting her across the side of the head. She staggered, falling backward onto the bed. Daniel's anger, born of months of jealousy and obsession, fueled his violent attack. He struck her repeatedly, not stopping until her body lay still, her face barely recognizable. Rachel stood paralyzed, her mind racing to comprehend what had just happened. But her terror quickly turned to panic as Daniel turned toward her, his eyes wild and crazed. He was no longer the husband she knew, this was a man possessed by his own demons. Fearing for her life, Rachel tried to run, but Daniel was faster. He lunged at her, knocking her to the ground. In a desperate struggle, Rachel fought back, but Daniel's rage was overpowering. He grabbed a pillow from the bed and pressed it against her face, suffocating her as she kicked and thrashed beneath him. The house fell eerily silent. Both women were dead. Stephen, though gravely injured, lay unconscious, barely clinging to life. The aftermath was a grotesque scene of blood, bodies, and shattered lives. Daniel, now realizing what he had done, collapsed to the floor, his anger giving way to shock and despair. He stared at the carnage around him, the weight of his actions finally crashing down. The bodies of his wife Claire and Rachel lay lifeless on the floor, their once vibrant lives extinguished in a moment of uncontrolled violence. He had murdered them both, and there was no undoing it. In his panic, Daniel grabbed his phone and dialed 911, his hands trembling. When the operator answered, his voice was barely coherent, overcome with horror and disbelief. He screamed into the phone, repeating over and over that there were 2 dead bodies in his house, his wife and his friend's wife. The call would mark the beginning of an investigation that would reveal the dark undercurrents of obsession, betrayal, and lust that had driven these suburban lives to their tragic end. As the police arrived at the Mason household in the early morning hours, they were greeted by a gruesome scene. Blood spattered across the bedroom, the bodies of Claire Mason and Rachel Carter lying motionless, and Stephen Carter barely clinging to life on the floor. Daniel Mason sat in the corner of the room, his face pale and hands covered in blood, mumbling incoherently. His 911 call had been filled with terror, but now, in the presence of law enforcement, he seemed almost detached, his mind unable to fully grasp the enormity of what had just occurred. The investigators quickly began piecing together the chaotic event, darker, more complicated reality, one filled with secrets, manipulation, and lies. The first break in the case came when detectives found Rachel Carter's journal tucked away in her bedside drawer. What at first seemed like a private diary documenting the mundane details of daily life soon turned into a chilling account of her growing suspicion and fear. For weeks, Rachel had been writing about her belief that Claire and Stephen were having an affair, but what she detailed went much deeper. She described how she had started to notice strange behavior from both her husband and Daniel. They were secretive, evasive, and often disappeared together, leaving her feeling uneasy and betrayed. Rachel wrote about confrontations with Stephen, in which he denied everything but became increasingly agitated. And then there was the final entry, written just days before the murders, where Rachel confessed her growing paranoia that something far more sinister was happening. The journal revealed that Rachel had been slowly unraveling emotionally, her jealousy and distrust pushing her to the edge. But what made investigators pause was a single line from one of her later entries: "I'm starting to think that Daniel and Stephen have been planning this all along." This cryptic statement led the police to dig deeper into the relationship between the 2 men. What they discovered was a series of encrypted messages exchanged between Daniel and Stephen, hidden on a secondary phone that was found in Daniel's office. These messages revealed that Daniel and Stephen's connection wasn't just about their shared agreement to swap partners, it went much further than that. They had been engaged in an intense, manipulative relationship that revolved around controlling their wives and pushing the boundaries of their secret sexual arrangement. The messages outlined their mutual frustrations with their wives and their shared fantasies about what life would be like without them. But the most chilling part was the final few messages, sent just hours before the murders. Stephen had written to Daniel, insinuating that their solution was finally in sight, that the problem would soon be taken care of. Daniel's reply was equally cryptic but sinister: "Tonight, it all ends. No more secrets." With this new evidence, the narrative of the night began to shift. While Daniel had been the one to physically commit the murders, it became clear that Stephen had played a key role in fueling the events that led to the deadly outcome. The once straightforward case of a jealous husband snapping in a fit of rage now appeared to be part of a much darker, premeditated plan. But the biggest revelation was still to come. When Stephen finally regained consciousness in the hospital, detectives were eager to question him. They expected him to either deny involvement or distance himself from Daniel's actions. But instead, Stephen gave a cold and calculated confession that shocked everyone. He revealed that the entire arrangement, the partner swapping, the late-night drinking sessions, the deepening emotional manipulation, had been a game for him and Daniel, one that had spiraled out of control. Stephen admitted that he and Daniel had become obsessed with the idea of dominating their wives, both physically and mentally. They had started by testing their boundaries with the partner-swapping arrangement, but as time went on, they began to toy with the idea of what life would be like without Claire and Rachel. What had started as a fantasy between the two men had escalated into a deadly reality. Both men had discussed the idea of getting rid of their wives, but it had always been vague, a twisted game between them. Until that night, when Daniel took the final step. Stephen claimed that he had never intended for things to go as far as they did, that he hadn't thought Daniel would actually go through with the murders. But the evidence, the messages, the journal, and the violent reality of that night, painted a different picture. He had egged Daniel on, manipulating him into believing that eliminating their wives was the only way to achieve the freedom they craved. The final twist, however, was Daniel's response to all of this. During his interrogation, Daniel claimed that he had no memory of the events leading up to the murders, blaming everything on Stephen's influence. He portrayed himself as a victim of Stephen's manipulation, a man who had been pushed too far by a friend who had been planting ideas in his mind for months. In the end, both men were arrested and charged, Daniel for the murders, and Stephen as an accomplice, facing charges of conspiracy and accessory to murder. The once seemingly ordinary suburban couples had hidden dark, obsessive desires that ultimately led to their own destruction. The final twist left the community in shock. What had begun as a sordid secret life of sexual experimentation had spiraled into a deadly power play between two men, whose shared fantasies of control and domination ended in the brutal deaths of their wives. The Masons and Carters had thought they. The murders of Claire Mason and Rachel Carter sent shockwaves through the community of Westwood Pines. The quiet suburban streets that had once seemed so safe were now tainted by the dark secrets of those who had lived behind its polished doors. Daniel Mason was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Stephen Carter, whose affair had ignited the tragedy, moved away from the town, his life forever haunted by the events of that night. What began as a secret experiment in sexual exploration had devolved into obsession, betrayal, and murder. In the end, no one in this story walked away unscathed, and the true horror lay in how deeply hidden desires and emotions can spiral out of control. The quiet suburban streets of Westwood Pines would never be the same again. Could keep their double lives hidden, but in the end, those secrets consumed them.